do. And the first thing, oh, thank you, Gina. The first thing that we were going to do was to really ask the different speakers in kind of a conversational style if they could talk about their research and its impact and relationship to sustainability and our community. So I'm going to kind of ask each individual person to do that. I'm going to also do an introduction before I kind of pass the ball. And the first person is my friend, Emily Elliott. Hi, Emily. It's so good to see you. Oh, she's like, oh, I'm on. I got it. So Emily, just a little bit of her background. She's a professor in geology and environmental science, and she's also the director and the co-founder of the Pittsburgh Collaboratory for Water Research, Education, and Outreach. And she really has made an enormous contributions to the environmental community, both at Pitt and beyond. And I'll say she helped me during a really difficult time with my mom. So I always feel a close bond to Emily. So without further ado, Emily.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. It really is an honor, and I'm super excited to learn about some of my Pitt colleagues that I've not met before and some of their research. I do have some slides I wanted to share. So I wasn't sure who could let me share them. Is that you, Melissa?
Can you share them, Emily? Oh, you, okay. You can share them, Emily.
All righty, here we go. Now, you would think I would know this by now, but are you seeing my slides or my notes?
Your slides.
Okay, great, perfect. Yay. I am in the Department of Geology and Environmental Science, like Melissa said. And I thought for a while about how to present what we do in sort of a broader sustainability context. And I thought a really good way to start that conversation is with, oddly enough, the carbon cycle. I feel like the carbon cycle and its importance to sustainability has really been ingrained in us now for some amount of time. And we're all, I think, very familiar with how human activities have altered the carbon cycle. I would say what's less well understood is that human activities like energy production and food production and building cities also impacts other nutrient cycles, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. But unlike carbon, these nitrogen and phosphorus cycles have compounds that dissolve in water. So as a result, when you have extra nitrogen and extra phosphorus, you get accumulation of these forms in aquatic ecosystems. And nitrogen and phosphorus are both very important for all living biota. They are a component of DNA and RNA. And so in that sense, they really are considered to limit ecologically how productive a system can be. So what happens is that when you have extra nitrogen and phosphorus, rates of photosynthesis increase and primary production increases. So in aquatic ecosystems, that would lead to things like blooms of phytoplankton. Here I'm showing two different types of phytoplankton or bacteria. And there are many different types of phytoplankton, including diatoms and green algae. However, there are some less innocuous forms, including microcystis shown here, that can produce toxins that can cause mortality and morbidity among humans and other biotic life forms. So it's these particular microsystems that are the culprit for what we commonly see now every summer in Lake Erie, which is an annually occurring cyano harmful algal bloom. But these events are not limited to Lake Erie. So unfortunately, the prevalence and frequency of coastal HABs are increasing globally. with threats to human health, ecological health, and also significant threats to economies in these coastal communities. At the same time, we really don't have a good understanding of the nutrient fluxes that are causing these changes. And I'm going to provide an example here that hits close to home. So the Mississippi River is one of the biggest rivers in the world, and the biggest contributor by volume to the Mississippi is the Ohio River. It comprises 38% of the total volume. It's a big deal, and it starts here in our backyard and flows some 900 miles where it joins the Mississippi River in Ontario, Illinois. In the past 5 years, there have been harmful algal blooms on the Ohio River that spans 600 miles. And in most cases, harmful algal blooms are restricted to coastal waters and lakes. It's very unusual that you get these occurring in rivers. So something is changing, and we have hit some sort of tipping point that is allowing these changes to occur. And so our research is really, in the case of nitrogen, trying to understand how human activities through things like energy production and transportation are impacting how nitrogen is distributed in the air and in ecosystems and ultimately to water bodies. And inevitably, all of our work starts out in the field where we're either collecting samples or collecting data or deploying sensors. In this case, I'm using the actual case of a field collected sample where we take those samples to the lab and we use bacteria to convert the nitrate in those samples to nitrous oxide gas here, N2O. And this N2O gas is then introduced to a mass spectrometer where we look at the stable isotopes of nitrogen and oxygen in that nitrous oxide. And what that allows us to do is to tell the relative amount of, for example, sewage in nitrate from a particular water body or stormwater runoff. And so this can be very powerful when you're trying to understand which nutrient sources are contributing to excess nutrients. And so for us, I think the utility here is that this can be a very efficient and targeted approach that can be used to improve water quality, but it can also provide a more mechanistic understanding of how these impacts are cascading through different parts of the Earth system. And so with that, I will.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think we are going to wait until everyone has finished until we do questions. I know I have several. Thank you for your beautiful slides too. So the next person is Kay, and Kay is a research assistant professor, and she's in the Department of Political Science. And her work really also spans beyond the Pittsburgh region, and her research also covers Japanese and Chinese political economy, their economies, with a focus on public finance and financial institutions. And so, Kay, we're really excited to hear about the work that you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on this Speakeasy panel, and I'm really honored to be a part of it as well. I thought that I would use this opportunity to introduce recent research that I've been working on. I'm actually in Japan right now. It's 5 a.m., which is one of the reasons why you see this background, because my real background is quite chaotic. And what I work on is I'm a political scientist and a social scientist, and I'm mainly interested in my research in the political incentives that motivate organizations, and especially in their economic and political behavior. And my recent book that just went to the publishers is about JA, which stands for Japan Agricultural Cooperatives. And this is a nationally organized farmer cooperative to which most farmers in Japan belong. And like agricultural cooperatives everywhere, their main incentive is to decrease the risks associated with agriculture for farmers nationwide by doing things like lowering the cost to collective action, by lowering, allowing them to do bulk purchases of inputs such as fertilizer, or allowing them to increase their negotiating ability with prices to what they sell, their agricultural produce. But from the perspective of sustainability, there are two underlying currents that I'm most concerned about with respect to agriculture, both in Japan, but actually throughout the Asia Pacific region, which I focus on in my research. And this also actually pertains to agriculture almost everywhere in the world. And those two trends are, one, aging, demographic shift, in particular, the aging of farmers, and how that relates to the sustainable maintenance of agricultural land. And the other is globalization, and in particular, in my interest, is global trade of agricultural goods, and how those two underlying currents incentivize farmers to behave in the way they do vis-a-vis these cooperatives, and the politics that involves. One of the most unfortunate things for Japan and agriculture in particular is that aging is happening very quickly. Japan is at the forefront of demographic shift if you look at worldwide demographic changes. And within that, farmers are aging the most rapidly in terms of sort of industrial group. And so currently, the average age of Japanese farmers is nearing the age of 70. And that is very much influencing how they are able to maintain the sustainable use of agricultural land. Unlike the United States, Japanese corporations are not allowed to directly own agricultural land. All agricultural land is owned 50% or more by individual farm households. And that's the reason why you see in my background here, agricultural land, individual plots of land and individual farms are extremely small in Japan. And this is the case in most of Asia. The average size of agricultural land in, for example, the United States is about 500 to 1,000 acres, whereas in Japan, it's about 2 acres. And so that difference alone can alert you to the challenges associated with maintaining agricultural land. And if you add on top of that, the fact that farmers are on average about 70 years old, and just 10 years ago, they were about 60 years old. So which means that in about 10 years, you can imagine that it might not quite be 80 years old, since a lot of 80-year-old farmers can't really farm anymore. But it's going to be approaching that. And the fact that this land is so small means that the mechanization and automation of agriculture is also very difficult. So one of the ways that I try to teach about this trend is through a class called The Politics of Food, Land, and Sustainability, which I've been teaching for about the last 3 years. And I'm extremely interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say today, because as a social scientist, my knowledge of things like what Emily just spoke about, the water quality, which has a lot to do with agriculture and the sustainability of agricultural land, my knowledge is very shallow. And so I now have a whole group of people that I can tap to when I start teaching again in the fall, and want them to look through my slides and make sure that I'm not saying something that's not quite true. Anyways, I'm really glad to be part of this conversation, and look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Hey, thank you so much. And also, a big thank you for getting up at 5 a.m. That takes real dedication. I really, really appreciate that. And clearly there are really nice connections between your work and Emily's work. So I'm glad we're able to make that connection as well. Next up, and I know she's here, I just can't see her yet, is Shanna, Dr. Shanna Tharp Gilliam. And she continues to really make really significant contributions to the Pittsburgh community. She works as the director of the Office of Evaluation for the Homewood Children's Village, and she's also a member of the Alcasan Board of Directors. And so her work is as a social scientist has really also been focused on social sustainability, and she's made enormous impacts throughout the county. And so I'm really happy that she's able to join us. There she is. Hi, Shanna. It's so nice to see you.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So I'm passing it over to you.
Awesome, excellent. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm actually, I'm going to just show you, I can't not have a slide if everybody else has a slide or two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and present, if you would let me, and I'm going to just hit a couple of highlights on some of the work that we're doing in the community to bring the issues of sustainability to the communities in the East Pittsburgh. So let me go ahead and grab the screen share here and grab my, okay, and then I'm going to hit present. So these projects are actually just give a smattering of the projects that we're doing in Homewood and at the Homewood Children's Village that have some impact with sustainability. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight a few of these, maybe I think 2 of them, to give you an idea of what we mean. So first of all, Pittsburgh. There's been, as we all know, a lot of social unrest. There's been a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of just disruption, between COVID, between the social unrest that we've seen across the country. And so in some ways, the idea of sustainability and why is this relevant could potentially just kind of fall off your radar if you're attending to some of these other issues that may feel either more urgent or more pressing. But what we wanted to do was make the connection between the issues of equity that we are seeing across our country and regionally and the issues of sustainability. So one of those projects is this project. It's the Climate Change, Health, and Equity Project. It's funded by the Kresge Foundation. And we kind of laugh internally because this project has so many different names. It depends on who you talk to, what we're going to call it. But the community members call it the 3H Community Partnership. It's a partnership between Homewood Children's Village, Green Building Alliance, the Hill District Consensus Group, and Centers of Life, and the University of Pittsburgh. So the purpose of, first of all, I wanted to just highlight, these are just a couple of the brochures, the flyers that we use to recruit for this project, because we were recruiting not only adults, but we were also recruiting young folks. So we really wanted to make it visually attractive to them. But the point is that this was a planning grant. So over this first 12 months, we focused on Hazelwood, Hill District, and Homewood to build a body of knowledge among a cohort of residents who would then go on to really better understand how do you, first of all, advocate for issues around sustainability in your communities? What are those issues? And then also, most importantly, it was a unification activity to just people who were very isolated. We were alone. So bringing people together, not only just from one community, but from 3 communities to basically say, hey, look, we're all in this together and we have a lot of the same issues. And of course, the idea was ultimately to think about some solutions to some of our community-focused sustainability issues. So as you can see here, these are the 3 key areas of impact around increasing knowledge, as I mentioned, about environmental issues, expanding partnerships, and then also advancing a policy agenda. So just to give you a sense for the focus of the work across the 12 weeks, these are some of the topics, and feel free to take a screenshot if you want to look at those a little more closely later. But the idea was to give a smorgasbord of topics that would, build a foundation of understanding, and make a connection between how is sustainability something that impacts my everyday life. If I'm a person who cares about equity, equality, and these issues, what is the connection between some of these sustainability issues and the things that impact my daily life? We brought in, for each of the 12 weeks, we brought in experts to talk about these areas. For example, week 6 brought in politicians from the city, the county, and the state levels of government to talk about some of the legislation that they were advocating for around equity and health equity. And we know that health, equity, the environment, they're all intertwined, and that's really what this was about. So like I said, there were 12 sessions, there were 31 participants, and what we always try to do is demonstrate our value for people's time by giving them stipends to support their participation, particularly during COVID when people were hit hard with their jobs and with needing additional resources. So you can see here the breakdown of the participants. We had really high participation. People really enjoyed it. They said that it was like the highlight of their week. And in fact, after the 12 weeks were up, they wanted to continue. And we were able to then find another opportunity to partner with Cornell University to build skills around how do you scale up advocacy activities around climate change, environmental issues, and sustainability. So about 18 of our participants continued on for an additional 5 weeks after that. It covered 4 different generations. We had folks from 16 to 76 who participated, and we really worked to present information in such a way that it was digestible for teens and youth, and also wasn't boring for people who may have had even a little bit more information about these areas than some others. So this is actually part of a longer presentation, which I won't present today, but it just gives you a snapshot of the type of work that we've been doing in the community to engage residents, because we feel strongly that in order for community members to be able to make contributions of their lived experience, which is very valuable to these conversations, they have to be knowledgeable of the frameworks that are being used, like the eco districts frameworks, the United Nations SDGs. You know what the SDGs are. And then also the social determinants of health. So these different frameworks that we're using, we wanted to really equip residents with that information so that they could then come up with, what their recommendations are for their communities, which is actually going to be the springboard for our next 3 years of work in this area, because we've gone on and we're able to get the follow-on funding. So we're going to be continuing this on for the next 3 years. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanna. I just wanted to say I had done work in the Larimer community, and one of the questions you asked was on collaboration and trust. And I feel like developing trust in communities is so critical. And that to me was, before we started to do any sort of collaborative work with the community, developing that trust was the first thing that I think was the most important step in our kind of longer term commitment and relationship to that community. The other thing is I need to share with you, we did do community action teams to kind of train the people that really went out and worked on training other people in the community, so that might be one way to potentially think about scaling. So I'll share that with you. And thank you for being with us today. The next person, I have the pleasure to introduce someone from my department, and it's Carla Eng. And Carla is an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering, and she is an international expert on PFAS. And one of the things that I think is really cool, she's actually giving congressional testimony on PFAS. And I think just, that to me as an assistant professor is just such an inspiration. And she's been interviewed by different local kind of outlets and also national outlets too. So her work is extremely important. And on a personal note, I will say I had to stop by Carla's house the one day to drop something off. And she said she was going to be puttering around in her garden, and I don't garden. And I was like, what does one do? And then I got to her house and she has her whole yard is a garden. So I was like, now I understand what she does. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So Carla.
Oh, thanks, Melissa. That's very nice. I am going to talk about PFAS, and I am going to share some slides for those of you who are not familiar with them. And I promise there's not a single chemical structure on here, so it's going to be friendly. Oh, and I think I can't share at the moment.
I think you can now.
There we go. Now I can. Awesome. All right. So for those of you who don't know about PFAS, these are what are known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is quite a mouthful, but basically they are non-stick chemicals. So if you are a person of a certain age, you may remember, everybody probably has some non-stick pans in their fridge, but if you're a person of a certain age, you probably remember your mom spraying down your couch with this Scotch Guard spray, or maybe the rug, so that, the kids could play on it and not leave any stains. And for a long time, the primary ingredients in Teflon and in Scotch Guard were some of these long-chain perfluoroalkyl acids, which, as it turns out, are not very nice chemicals. And because of their widespread use and the fact that these chemicals are extremely persistent, they are now present in more than 97% of not just Americans, but everybody all over the world. So we all have these chemicals in our blood. And they're kind of the antithesis to sustainability because they are so persistent that they basically prevent the circular use of resources and all the things that we would like to do in order to achieve sustainability. And in addition to that, they are very harmful to our health. So this is from a recent review, basically cataloging all of the health effects that are associated with certain PFAS. And the most striking observation from looking at this is just the number of biological systems that these chemicals can impact. They run the gamut from cancers to developmental toxicity. And one of the most important toxic effects that is driving a lot of concern about how much should be in our drinking water, for example, and that is very relevant to today, is that these chemicals are immune toxicants. So they are able to reduce the efficacy of vaccines, for example, by affecting our immune system. So this is definitely not something we want around, especially where we are right now. And in terms of research, what my group does is we do a lot of detailed modeling and some experimental work to understand how these chemicals get into our bodies, where they go once they get into the body. And because there are so many of these different chemicals within the class of PFAS, how do we predict which ones are going to be toxic or not? And I have a lot of very talented graduate students who work really hard doing this. But I feel like as much as I love this detailed, very sciencey part of my job, I don't feel like this is the most necessarily impactful part of my job. And I wanted to share this cartoon with you, which is related to climate change, but I think it's also very relevant for anybody doing work in sustainability. And that is that we all understand very well what the problems are, right? So there's a lot of great research in whatever our areas are about problematic practices, problematic chemicals, problematic ways of doing things. And yet we find ourselves always battling the same problems over and over again. And we're just exhausted by the fact that as much research as we produce, what does that lead to, right? And I think folks on the social sciences side have a better handle on this than we as engineers do. But what we might ask ourselves is, what is the role of science and engineering in affecting policy change? And what sort of important questions should we be navigating in our research, right? So on the educational and productivity side of my research, we do a lot of work with molecular modeling and toxicokinetic models and machine learning, because students love machine learning now. That's the new hot thing. But a lot of the work that I do is around, personally with my research time, is around understanding policy perspectives and frameworks that can help move the needle forward. So I just wanted to highlight this one recent paper that we published in 2019 about PFAS specifically, which is a paper that in a way says you don't need all of my other research. It's a paper that says that high persistence alone should be enough for us to be able to say that we shouldn't use chemicals in certain products. And because persistence by itself means a chemical will be around for so long that if somewhere down the line we discover there's a negative impact, the reversal of that exposure is going to be so difficult and costly, as we found with PFAS, that it's not worth the risk. So it's basically trying to figure out, how do we cut off this endless cycle of being stuck with problems that we should have seen coming. And so we argue that evidence of some type of effect, so this detailed analysis of toxicity, shouldn't be required because high persistence alone can be used as a sufficient indicator or a proxy for adverse effects. And it's basically, this paper and other papers that I've worked on with collaborators is all about how do we turn off the tap on hazardous chemicals, irrespective of all the other fun and interesting and important in other ways research that I do. And I just wanted to leave this sort of high level argument here for us to maybe chat about. This was a really famous or perhaps infamous editorial that was written in 2016 by the then editor-in-chief of Environmental Science and Technology, David Sedlak, called Crossing the Imaginary Line. And he was talking about the folks who became famous with the Flint, Michigan lead in water issue. And he basically argued that engineers shouldn't move from being educators and researchers to allies of a particular cause, no matter how just, because then you jeopardize the social contract that underpins the tradition of financial support for basic research. And he was coming from an objective and very traditional place in terms of the way engineers think, but he was quickly shot down by a lot of his colleagues. So this was a response from Deborah Swackhammer, talking about how there is no imaginary line, there's a continuum. And that what's really important is that the conversation is more nuanced than just being objective and unbiased, and that the most interesting conversations begin when we start to ask what science means to issues of societal importance and what action should be taken, if any. And a second response also said that very clearly. Some believe that there is tension between science and activism that is to be avoided. I do not. Scientists simply cannot ignore the role that science and technology has historically played and continued to play with the growth of social and environmental awareness. And I really do feel like this past year and a half, a lot of this is coming to a head, understanding, everything that we talk about with social unrest, with racism, structural racism in science, but also with climate change and pandemics. We see scientists taking leading roles and how important that is. So I just wanted to leave with this cartoon that I've been using for a long time, which is frustrating in itself because it means that's been the mindset for a long time. But I think it's a pretty apt cartoon for what a lot of us are doing here, regardless of how much people believe in the problems we know are out there. The solutions are only going to serve to improve the world around us. So thanks.
Carla, I feel like I'm speechless. You succinctly said so many wonderful things in a short period of time. And really, I personally have been reflecting on the same issues that you bring up. Like, we know what we're supposed to be doing. We know what the problems are and why can we not do the solutions? And it becomes incredibly frustrating. And so I see a lot of kind of heads nodding too. And so we may have to have a conversation over a glass of wine too in the future. So thank you so much, Carla. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions about the efficacy of vaccines too, that is probably on the minds of many people. Next up, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jessica Burke, and she is a professor in the Graduate School of Public Health, and her work explores the health disparities in women and children and seeks to improve community health. So Jessica, thank you so much for being here today.
It is my pleasure, and it has been fantastic because I see a couple faces, familiar faces. Sam Ford was in a class previously. It's great to see you again. And I have learned so much already, so I look forward to continued conversation. So because I have the floor in a few minutes and no slides, but I do have notes, I just wanted to start with a bit of a primer on public health, because I always like to take the opportunity to just remind people that we exist. So, sort of COVID-19 and the pandemic has meant that many more are aware of public health as a field, but still some misperceptions exist. And so public health really works to promote and protect the health of people and communities. And so it's great. I can see so many connections with all of the work that we're talking about here today. And just to distinguish it between medicine and public health. So, medicine really treats people who are sick, and we treat and sort of work to prevent illness and to promote health, and well-being. And so I think I take every opportunity possible to provide this World Health Organization definition of health. And I think it will resonate with many of you that the WHO defines health as a complete state of physical, mental, social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And that really fits into a lot of what we're talking about here today. So my own research and my teaching, I love teaching, that's a big part of my job, and mentoring really seeks to embrace the power of community, complexity, and creativity. And so I want to talk a bit about each of those here today. In terms of research content areas, I started my work in HIV/AIDS. I work primarily to address health issues among cisgender women and adolescents. And in starting in HIV, I realized that there's a context within which we live. It's not rocket science, right? But it took me a little while to figure out that that's true for health too. There are our interpersonal relationships. There's a neighborhood context, and that happens for all health related issues, not just environmental when you think about how they impact health and well-being. And so much of my work now focuses on the intersections of HIV, violence, substance use, mental health, and I talk about it as the complexities of life and the realities of life. But what I want to talk about today is more of how I do that work, because I think it intersects really nicely with everything we're talking about here. So the role of community has been addressed a couple times already. Much of my work is community engaged, so in partnerships with communities. And it was actually during graduate school in the long time ago, way long time ago, I won't even say when, but I was working in northern Thailand around HIV prevention among women. And actually we were doing a clinical trial of AZT, so an antiretroviral medication to prevent maternal to child transmission of HIV. And it was a really important study, right? It's led to what we now use for PrEP and other HIV prevention. But there was a discourse going on about, was it ethical to involve women in the study when their standard of care was not that, that within northern Thailand, they did not have access to these medications to prevent transmission. And that's a really important discussion. But as a master's degree student, I was really struck by how the women in the trial and their voices were not part of this discussion. Nobody had talked to them. And it was just this sort of light bulb moment of, absolutely, I want to discuss these issues, but I want the people who are most impacted to have a voice. And that's where I sort of landed in the field of what we call community-based participatory research. So essentially engaging communities and stakeholders in the research directly. And so, I did some work there, working with women, talking with them. We won't get into that here, but I have gone on to do much more work that's community engaged and teach a couple of classes about that, the power of embracing communities and working in partnership. We heard an example earlier about how it really forces you to be action oriented, that, you know, when you're doing research with communities, it's pretty hard to take it away and to just go sit in your office and analyze that data. People are going to ask you, well, what are you doing with it? Which is great to be held accountable. So I think that we talked a little bit about the development of trust as being a first step. And so, you know, I would advocate for community engaged work as being really essential. The other piece that really guides my work is addressing complexity, really embracing it, right? The world is really messy, and reality is that it's messy. And we have been taught for a very long time to be more reductionist oriented, to really be looking for what's the key, when in fact there are many, right? And they're all interacting. And a couple people here have already talked about sort of the mechanistic understandings, like how do things interact with each other? It's not just that there are multiple levels, but in fact those interact with each other. And so I have, sort of public health has been a little late to the game of really picking up on system science. And so what we've been doing is trying to promote the use of system science, systems thinking, the specific methods within public health and health behavior research. So the idea that we can look at the range of factors and the complexities associated with it, and that there are actually methods for doing that. So social network analysis, agent-based modeling, there are ways to explore that qualitatively, and there are also ways to explore it quantitatively. And that's really exciting to be able to think about how the factors influence each other. And it's by looking at those causal mechanisms and connections that they can really help to serve as critical decision support tools, right? So thinking about how can we use those to think through the what ifs. What if we were to change this? What are the leverage points and what can we advocate for? So following up on the last presentation, that I pretty strongly believe that we should be in the world of activism and advocacy, but unfortunately we don't have much training in that. So we recently published a theme issue of Health Education and Behavior. It's a journal that advocates for using system science, systems thinking within this field. If you want to see an excruciating amount of detail about it, I encourage you to check it out. And we've been working to get funding in this space. And so we just submitted a proposal to look at actually alcohol-involved sexual violence among students. So that's just one system, sort of how are things involved and what can we do to identify leverage points. And then the last piece, because I know I'm running out of time, but it is probably my favorite, is creativity. So thinking about connections and how do we make something new and novel? How can we take what we see in one field and apply it to another? And I really enjoy that piece of thinking about methods, and if it's happening in one space, how can we use it within public health and within the health arena? And so I've done that with a method called concept mapping back in 2005. Really introduced it to the field of public health as a research method that is participatory. So you probably know what concept mapping is, but do it as a research method with communities and stakeholders. And so we've done that in many, many settings. The Pittsburgh study, we did it here to help to develop the framework that they're using for that work. So a community-driven framework for addressing child thriving. And, everybody, well, what is that? Well, let's go talk with the communities and figure out what it is. And now we have a great framework for it. And I guess, that that dedication to creativity. I'm not an artist. I wish I were. Like, I love art. I love artists. But what we have recently thought about is, well, how can you use art to advocate for issues, or how can you use it as a research method? And I was really fortunate to have a doctoral student who also thinks this sort of way and is game to do some crazy things. And she came up with a research method that she developed as part of her dissertation called collaborative filmmaking. And this is where you do films in collaboration with community partners to address health topics. It's a research method, so it will give you nuanced information. So just think about it, that like if you do interviews or surveys, you get one layer. But if you ask people to develop a film and think slightly differently, you get so much more. But they also are advocacy tools. So you have a film that you can all watch and respond to. And that has proved to be amazing. So she did it for her dissertation work around menstrual health. We're now doing a project around mental health. But I think the applications are, unlimited in terms of how we could use it in this space too. And we recently just submitted a proposal to the National Endowment for the Arts to fund an arts and health research lab here at Pitt. So fingers crossed, we could get that funding and really serve as a platform for all of us to think about how we can be more creative in our work. So I know I could go on forever. That's not the job here. But just to reiterate, engaging communities are really important in the process of research and translation. Using innovative methods to address complexity. The world is messy, we all know that, but there are methods that can help us unpack that. And then harnessing creativity. It can really help us to develop and advocate for necessary interventions. So with that, I will wrap up and say thank you so much for having me here.
Jessica, thank you so much for being here. And I just wanted to mention, I just started to work with a girls' school in Kenya with a person named Kenya. And I think we're going to try to look into the concept mapping idea to work with the girls there. And one of the things that they're really struggling with is there's a sugar factory nearby that's, providing employment, but it's also really leading to very negative health effects and causing asthma too. And so we really do want to explore different opportunities. So thank you for giving me that kind of different way to set up the research problem with the girls. So the next person, there's Mary. Hi, Mary. It's so good to see Mary Omer. She's an associate professor in social work, and her work encompasses sustainability, social justice, and community-based initiatives, both nationally and internationally. And her most recent focus was on youth violence prevention by facilitating local Pittsburgh community residents and stakeholders and strengthening programs and support for community well-being. So Mary, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Sorry I was a little late, but I enjoyed Jessica's presentation. And I'm going to talk a lot about community-based participatory research methods, because they are really important in engaging communities in a very, very meaningful way in the work we do around sustainability. And both internationally and locally, I think those are the strategies to use, right? Also part of the Pittsburgh study, so is Dr. G from Homewood Children's Village, who we both are on the leads for the policy in place committee. And I'm working with Dr. Miller on a child thriving matrix. We're actually going to have community conversations in both the West End and in North Braddock to help communities identify components of child thriving using the child thriving and youth matrix that was developed through the Pittsburgh study through a very interactive process. So pretty excited about that. Also been working with a group in Perry Hilltop and Fineview using community-based participatory research methods to engage youth and adults in preventing violence and we formed a community advisory board. They were trained in Pitt's wonderful, I don't know if anybody talked about this yet, wonderful community-based participatory research ethics training. It's fantastic. The community members can get certified to be part of the IRB process, and they're involved in every step of the research, from methodology, helping with our design of surveys, planning activities, all of that. And so that's been a wonderful experience. We are hopefully going to be doing a training to train youth and adults in preventing violence using restorative practices, restorative justice practices. Hopefully when we can all meet in person, we'll be doing that. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. G for the almost 2.5 to 3 years coming up in Homewood on another project called Research for Equity and Power. And this project really is very, very related to 2 of the UN sustainability goals. One, to reduce inequalities, and the other, to promote sustainable cities and communities. We know this Pittsburgh has changed over the years dramatically. Neighborhoods have seems like overnight changed and threats of displacement and gentrification have increased, and then calls for equity and equitable development have also increased. We have an equitable development strategy for Pittsburgh that was developed through Neighborhood Allies. We have Homewood has a comprehensive plan that specifically states that their call for revitalization and to prevent displacement and to call for equity. And so, and Dr. G has been involved in through Homewood Village, through the Leadership Institute. Many of the residents trained in their Leadership Institute were also concerned about equity and equitable development. And so she and I together applied for funding from AmeriCorps and received it to engage a group of youth and adults in Homewood in 2019 in a series of community conversations about equity, equitable development, and social justice issues. And I'm going to just share really quickly the product of those conversations. We have a playbook. It's called the Equitable Development Playbook. I can put it in the chat hopefully it'll be connected. But this is our group. We have over 30 youth and adults. We hired this Donnell Pearl as our community researcher. He's a Homewood resident. He works for Pitt. These are all the people that we gathered. We had students, Miranda Messier, one of our students from social work. We've had students all along working on this project. So that's been really powerful. And really, this playbook brings together all of the findings and information from our community conversations. So it's a guide that informs residents on how they can influence positive neighborhood change in an equitable way, right? It compiles all the information from our community conversations. And the goal is to really increase civic engagement. Again, we had a community advisory board. We still meet with them. We've done a ton of virtual workshops and presentations with them since the pandemic started to share this work with the wider community. And they still are guiding our work. So the playbook is really for residents to use to influence equitable development. And so what's in it is there's definitions and examples of civic engagement and equitable development. There's key strategies for civic engagement. These are organizing and advocacy strategies for influencing equity and equitable development. There's a roadmap that actually takes people through worksheets and examples and case studies to say, how do you look more closely at an issue? How do you begin to understand it? How do you engage others around it and organize people to address a specific issue, and how do you act on it? And so section 5 are the plans and policies, right? The Homewood Comp Plan, the Equitable Development Strategy for Pittsburgh, community land trusts, all the different strategies. And and with contact information, like this is who you talk to if you want to influence. This is how you call them or email them, and these are the ways to engage with them around influencing these issues. And so they can, if they're more interested in zoning issues or land trust issues or affordable housing issues, residents can find the information they need to influence those issues in this playbook. And then stay involved. So we have a lot of information about community organizations to connect with, legislators for Homewood, all of that in this playbook. So that is that playbook, and I will put it in the chat. We also had a wonderful experience last summer where we engaged young people through a program that Dr. G ran called Change Champions. So it's a summer learn and earn program. And it was with, I think we had about 10 youth, and they put visual boards together because we talked to them. So we did sessions, so did the Green Building Alliance, so did a group called Science Genius, and obviously Homewood Children's Village. And so I'm gonna share just super quickly their visual boards on the key concepts that we went through in our community conversations. So they also tied their work to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So just very quickly, I'm going to show this and then I'll put it in the chat. But so we talked about what is gentrification, and then they did visual boards on this is what I think gentrification is. So here's an example of one. Gentrification is a middle class upgrade. Colored people can't win. I thought that was very powerful. Gentrification helps no one but the wealthy white man and his wallet, forcing minorities out. So then we also talked about revitalization. That's revitalization and equitable development is the opposite of gentrification, right? It's done by neighborhood people. It's led by neighborhood people. And so here were their pictures of revitalization. Kind of, what they thought revitalization should look like. And we had great conversations around these pictures. So, and then we talked about redlining and equitable development again being the opposite of redlining, right? And what did that mean to the young people? So we went through the Pittsburgh redlining maps with them, they connected it directly to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we talked about civic engagement. What is civic engagement? What can young people do to be more civically engaged about these issues? And then they talked about, ways that they had been engaged in the past and ways that they got inspired through this Learn and Earn program to be more engaged in the future. So I just think they're very powerful representations of how young people think about these issues. So I'm happy to put both of those in the chat and share with you and answer any questions. But we're also going to be doing our Research for Equity Power project in the Hazelwood neighborhood next. So we're looking forward to that. Dr. G and I partners in this whole process.
So Mary, thank you as well. And those, the visual boards were so powerful. I mean, just they really kind of strike you emotionally. And it's one thing to, hear what you're working on, but to see those visualizations, they're very, very powerful. So thank you for sharing those with us.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was very powerful having the conversations with the young people about them as well. So.
And one of the things so Carl is a civil and environmental engineer as well. I always, and we talk about some of these things in my classes, and really, as a civil engineer, we're making a lot of these decisions too, related to where are the transportation systems going. How, we're also in planning meetings, like where do these red lines, where have they happened? And so, I think it's such an important intersection for all disciplines to really understand the ramifications, the generational ramifications of these decisions. So, thank you, Mary, for sharing those.
You're welcome.
I have like a ton of questions and prepared questions. I wanted to just do one more question before we kind of open it up to the audience, because this is super important to me and hopefully to you as well. One of the things that we talked about in the last Speakeasy, and I've been like, waking up in the middle of the night thinking about this, is related to Pitt's sustainability moonshot. So so I emailed my colleagues on the panel and said, I really would want to get your opinion on what is Pitt's sustainability moonshot. Because, if we can, really harness all of the talent that we have at Pitt and maybe even an additional investment, what could and should we be working on? And so I don't know if there's someone that wants to go first, or I can kind of point to somebody first, but is there, Emily, I bet you have a great answer.
I have an answer. I've been thinking about it.
It's a good question, right?
It is a good question. It is really a good question. And it was hard to think at that scale because we're not necessarily used to thinking at that scale. But for me, and what I've been thinking about lately, I would love to see Pitt become a leader for envisioning a different environmental future for the region. And part of that is because I know Pitt has been involved with these conversations about reimagining Appalachia and the Marshall Plan for Middle America. But if we're actually going to go in that direction, if we're actually on the precipice of having a cleaner energy economy, then everything around us could potentially change. Our air could get better, our water could get better, the social structures in our communities could change. The governance structures could change, and public health hopefully would improve. And right now, we don't have the capacity to show any of those co-benefits. We're not doing enough in terms of monitoring and lifting up faculty across disciplines to be able to document these co-benefits that will hopefully be coming down the pipe.
Thank you, Emily. And I'll just say, I hope it's okay that I can say this. I was driving out to Newcastle this weekend, and I finally went past the cracker plant. And it's one of those things where I've been hearing about this for 2 years. And until you see it, like you have to drive past like the cracker plant to really get a sense of the magnitude of what's happening. Has anyone else been there? Anyone? No, I tapped my daughter. I'm like, you have to see, you have to see this. But I think that that's a really important conversation if we are going to think about creating a different environmental future.
Like, why can't we have nice things too? Why can't we have environmental enforcement? Why doesn't anybody, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think because we have traditionally had a resource extractive economy, sort of that's the mindset. And I feel like, Pitt could do a lot in terms of leading and using its faculty to help change that.
And I do think, we do have the Marshall Plan for Middle America, and to try to understand how that could potentially fit in and really complement the work that we're doing at the university. And also, they are having these legislative sessions on the Marshall Plan for Middle America, and really thinking about how Pittsburgh in particular can think about resources in a new manner. So for example, from a circular economy perspective and the Appalachian region too, I think that needs to be a part of the conversation as well. Okay, anyone else want to talk about Pitt Sustainability Moonshot? I didn't know you went by Dr. G, which is super, super impressive. So
No,
Dr. G.
honestly, it's really for old people and young people. It seems like those are the folks who have trouble with Shanna and Tharp Gilliam,
Oh,
forget it. So, so anyway, you know, I was thinking, when you look at the 5,600 part-time, 8,200 full-time, and then 800 research and postdoc associates. That's it's a lot of people. And at the same time, I think that it could be useful to leverage the additional university network to really come together around some of these big issues. You know, Emily, I agree. I would like to have nice things too. And when I think about kind of the social determinants of health, and we talk about employment, housing, medicine and health, justice, education, transportation, you know, these are huge areas in our society that have to be transformed if we're actually going to see changes in the culture that would lead to improved air quality, improved water quality, building in a battalion of the next generation who are going to be ready for 21st century opportunities. So when I think about moonshot, that's what I think about. You know, how can we leverage, you know, not only the 13, 15,000 people at Pitt, but how do we, you know, leverage the entire, you know, eds, meds, and tech infrastructure that are really benefiting from the wonderfulness of the Pittsburgh region, you know, having access to the affordable housing stock and, you know, the high quality medical system, and, you know, just being a real beacon for importing people. Some of the brightest minds in the country and in the world come to Pittsburgh. And it's disheartening at the same time to know that all of this is going on, and to know that, you know, there are 40 communities out of 90 that are underrepresented, that are disproportionately not experiencing these renaissance. So those are the types of places that's the size of what I would love for us to do, you know, as a Pitt community. To be able to actually, I think that's where our moon is. I think that we need to, you know, shoot as large as possible. I think that we have so many untapped human resources who, when you look back through the decades of, you know, innovation and invention, and you look at, you know, some of the folks who invented the types of devices that have really made our lives better, from things as basic as, you know, we talked about menstrual equity, from the maxi pad to the washing machine dry. I mean, when you look, and those are, you know, these are people who, if we were to take a snapshot of modern day Pittsburgh, are completely disconnected from technology resources, access to improved education. I think you hear where I'm going, but those are the types of things that I think about when I think about Pitt's moonshot.
Yeah, and that, you know, the access, I just read a report, and it was, and this is, you know, when you think about rural connections as well, even really close outside of the city, there was one community where 25% of the students didn't have broadband access. Like they, you know, they have not had broad, and that, you know, when that 25%, and to think about like the ramifications of that in the future, I think, you know, it's difficult to envision what's going to happen. So thank you, Dr. G. I really appreciate it.
If I can just piggyback off your point in with one small statement. At the beginning of the pandemic, Homewood Children's Village did a survey of our families and our participants, and we found that only 35% of the youth that we served had a device more powerful than a cell phone, a smartphone, on which to get their education. So when you talk about the technology divide, I mean, it's massive. We're even working right now, we're partnering with CMU to bring broadband to the neighborhood. So, you know, we're really trying to work on those types of equity issues at the Village, and we look forward to partnering with Pitt even more. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. G. Any of our other panelists want to talk about the moonshot?
I might say something. So I think everybody's sort of on the same page, because it's all about how do we actually achieve sustainability here, right? And I think part of it is having some bravery and being willing to talk about not doing things the way we've done things forever. But for me, it's really about having the university walk the walk, and make sure that we are representing the things that we're teaching our students about, because we know our students are into this stuff. How many of the students want to get a sustainability certificate? This is one of the most popular things at the school. They have this in mind, but they may not see that being reflected in their university experience and the things around them. And so it's sometimes hard to get buy-in. And then what does it mean to be an urban campus, right? We're different from other universities in the fact that we're supposed to be integrated with the city of Pittsburgh. And what are we doing to have our interactions with the city? I mean, this is in line with what everybody's been saying, but how do we integrate our vision and our ethics with the way that we interact with the communities around us, with the businesses that we associate with, and, you know, all of those factors?
Yes. Yes. Can I just say, I agree totally with Dr. G and Carla. I mean, I think it's the partnerships with community and centering our work with community and community partners that gets us to the moon. I think that's the way to go. I mean, I know that the university we've been, and I'm sure a few of you are on the Community Engagement Center Initiative Internal Advisory Group. I've been on that a few years. We are making these very deliberate place-based hyper-local connections with, you know, Homewood, the Hill, and Hazelwood. But I always advocate, this is how we should do the work with all of our communities, the principles and the things that we're putting in place in terms of respectful and effective engagement and true, genuine partnerships and research and everything else should be instituted no matter where Pitt works. So what we're learning from these hyper-local engagements, we better do in other places. I think that's a huge thing. And I think throughout the pandemic, we've tried to come alongside community to address needs of where they were, including helping with getting laptops out to kids in Pittsburgh Public School District, to helping community organizations like Homewood Children's Village reach out to people who are isolated and connect them to food and to housing supports and other things. Helping with the vaccine clinics. I mean, doing all this stuff has been alongside. And I have to, credit Dr. Lena Dastilio for making sure we were on the right path to begin with, and we didn't go ahead of community, right? And all these things. So I think that's how we get to the moon. And because we won't be spinning our wheels on ineffective things that aren't really grounded in reality in people's lived experience. So
I think that is a really important part. Is one of the things, that I really think about, and Gina's thought about a lot, is we're making this incremental change. And that we're all kind of doing this really, really cool stuff when we come together into forums like that. It's just, kind of the talent and the passion of so many of the people at Pitt comes through, but we need like kind of catalytic movement in order to really think about how we can start to really realize some of these moonshots. Jessica, it looks like you were going to comment.
Yeah, I've been trying to formulate it into something actually really articulate, but I'll just spew it out. The pieces of the partnership being so important. And when you had posed this question in email earlier this week, I was really thinking that, it's breaking down some of these silos. They are sort of slowly crumbling, but it's how do we build the relationships across the disciplines that is so key. I don't have the answer to how to do that except for just keep pushing. And I think actually the answer lies a bit in the students too, right? Sort of how are we training the next generation? How are we responding to what they want? And that we as faculty and the administration need to move faster, right? To be alongside of what that sort of desire and need is. And Carla, I love what you said about we need to be braver, because it's a nice reframe of we need to not, fear failure, like that it is okay to take risks. And so I think a nicer way of saying that is be braver to take those, because there is such risk aversion, to doing anything differently, or, we've got to like plan for it forever and then we miss the train. And so sort of, I guess everything that everyone has said, I just want to like thumbs up and say thank you again for including me in this, and that I hope we can continue these conversations too, both personally, but then also between the schools in terms of building those partnerships, because I think it is that, partnership, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, whatever you want to call it, but actually working together as a team, which is going to be where we, the moonshot. And I was also thinking, it's not just the moonshot, it's like, okay, then what, right? That like, stop thinking at the moon, think to Mars, think to what is the next thing, and that we have to keep pushing. Thanks.
Yeah. I ran this other workshop and we called it the Jupiter shot. So I should have done Jupiter shot. I should have known, I should have known better. But I do think to kind of build on what Jessica said, is that in terms of especially leadership at the provost level and the different deans, in terms of doing transdisciplinary work, I don't think we've ever been in a better position at Pitt in order to really do that. And I think, especially from the last Speakeasy, I was so inspired by all of the deans were saying the same thing. I mean, they really were. And I think that that's something that I haven't seen at Pitt. I did want to give Aurora the opportunity. So Aurora is one of my close friends too. So thank you for being here, Aurora. She's been doing so much work on carbon neutrality and kind of thinking about the vision also for Pitt sustainability. So Aurora, do you just want to maybe say a little bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Aurora Gerard. I'm the director of sustainability for the university. I had to jump out in the middle actually to go to a conversation about pouring rights. So I missed Mary and Jessica, and I'm going to watch the recording because I was very excited to hear what you two were up to. But I love sort of where I came back in on the moonshot, because, I can't talk a lot about where we are on pouring rights, but for those of you who don't know what that are, because I had no idea what that was before we started this conversation, it's where the university basically negotiates about, beverages that are available at the university. Primary players in that space might be, large soda companies that you could think about. And so the moonshot in that space is a campus free of single-use plastics, which students have asked us for, and we are asking as part of our process, right? So, but there's things like that happen at the university that are behind the scenes until they are not behind the scenes anymore. And so that's just my assurance to you that we are absolutely working on those things. It's going to take us time, right? There will be incremental progress in those space, but that's one small piece. Melissa's comment of our carbon neutral goal by 2037, that's a great example of where we can leverage and must sort of bring our academic expertise out of the classroom into campus and to students and, to our communities in partnership. As part of that, we've been developing the Pitt Climate Action Plan. It'll be out in the middle of the summer. But really this need for education and engagement and outreach about climate change in general, about greenhouse gas mitigation, about climate justice, and getting Pitt out saying those words, making and explaining to residents how climate change is an equity issue, climate justice is racial justice. These are things that as an institution, we have not ever said out loud because we were never active in the climate space in the way that we are now. So I think you'll see us institutionally taking these steps that you want us to. And the other thing that I'll leave you with is the new plan for Pitt 2025 is expected to be out in the next couple of weeks. I've seen a draft. Sustainability is in there in a way that I think you'll be excited about and that I'm excited about.
It wasn't in the last one explicitly.
And so is interdisciplinary research. In ways that I think cues all of us up for very interesting moonshots that we've dreamt about for years, but never really saw the pathway to. So
thank you, Laura. Okay, any questions from the audience? This is always like super awkward, and I'm like, please, people, like, don't be shy now. Like, now's not the time. Now's not the time to be shy.
So my name is Manisha Nigam. I'm in the regional campus of Johnstown. And I just wanted to kind of say that this is my first Speakeasy, so I appreciate the invitation. Aurora, this might be more an interesting, I teach a class called Green Chemistry and Sustainability. And a part of that class is the students propose sustainability projects that can be administered on campus. So my students actually wrote how we can generate biodiesel out of the waste vegetable oil that we currently are paying a company to come and pick up the waste oil to haul it away, and we can actually create our own biodiesel. So I actually found out even a school called Loyola University in Chicago, they have their own plant, and the students had a breakdown and we had a budget and everything. And, the concerns were, but I'm thinking that Pitt is such a bigger place. And has anybody ever considered a biodiesel production, which we can even get a license to sell once we produce more than what we can consume?
Yeah, so right before COVID, the Mascaro Center for Sustainable Innovation, the Office of Sustainability, we were trying to pull together, I forget what we were calling it, Gina. It was sort of like a meet and greet between Pitt operational heads and faculty to really better systematize and create relationships to do partnerships just like the one that you're talking about, right? So you're in a very specific space, but everybody else in this call is too, right? So you might think, oh, I'd love to do like, a sociology project related to the Pitt community. Like, how do I get to survey them, employees and that sort of thing. So it could go in any way, and we were trying to systematize that. Specifically to you, Manisha, it's great to see you here. Welcome. Yeah, we should talk because there are a couple of projects, a couple classes like that have either are sustainability focused or always incorporate a sustainability class at or project at Pitt in everything from environmental studies to engineering to computer science to business. And so we should get that going on at Johnstown.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I have one more question. So I'm completely switching the topic. So I don't want to do that. So Melissa, I'll let you go ahead and say what you were trying to say. My bad.
Thank you. I would just add, I do think, like Aurora has mentioned, like it's crazy. Like we're doing a senior design class. So one person's talking to this person, another person. There's really not this like centralized hub of how we can discern like who should be working on different projects. And Mary, I'm sure you probably encounter similar things. Jessica, Kay, like we all encounter these different things. And then what happens is like the people that do want to work with students, it becomes, they are the person that you go to all the time, and then they become burnt out. And so we do want to think about how we can take these projects and then also build on them, so like over time, you can like actually build on the work that's being done. And so hopefully we'll be able to kind of facilitate that portal, if you will, in the future. And I think that is something that we're hearing that a lot of people want. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, so, Patrick, yes, Pitt has a U Park facility, which I am well aware of because one of the senior design teams is working on the U Park facility, that could be a potential space for biodiesel research and production. So thank you, Patrick. Okay, I did have one question, and this is not going to necessarily be sustainability related. So, Carla, tell us about the vaccine and the efficacy.
Yeah, so there's been one paper on the impact of PFAS on the COVID-19 vaccine, but that's not the research I was talking about. It was actually for diphtheria and one other, a typical vaccine. Yeah, that now my mind is blanking on. But there's been studies done on at least 2 or 3 populations that show this in children, and it is in agreement with studies on rodents as well. So I have a good friend who's an expert on immune toxicity of PFAS, and she's testified in front of Congress a bunch of times. she's a very cool woman, but her research has clearly shown that these chemicals at extremely low doses has this impact. And, clearly that's something we want to avoid. Yeah. And the exact reason for it is still, being researched. So we do still need the research to figure out why these things happen. I'm not going to say that we don't need to do research into toxicity, because I think one of the, Manisha, you mentioned green chemistry. One of the goals that we have, of course, is to figure out how we design chemicals that don't have these properties, right? So I think that's where the research needs to head too, is how do we prevent these things from the beginning? Yeah.
Well, with that, I wanted to please join me in giving like a virtual toast and a thank you to the great panelists. And I really appreciate your time and energy, creativity, and thought. So thank you so much for being with us. Okay. All right.